Something is unfolding right now in one of the most strategically critical waterways on the planet, and almost no one is explaining it with the clarity it deserves. Not the drone strikes, not the burning tankers, not even the oil prices spiking on your news ticker. What matters, what actually matters, is the calculated, methodical chess game being played across a narrow strip of water that quietly controls the energy lifeline of the modern world, a 21-mile choke point. And one nation just played the card it has been holding for 4 decades. Iran made its move. And what followed, the destruction, the global scramble, the coalition response now assembling in real time, tells you everything about where this conflict is heading and what it means for every person on Earth who pays an electricity bill, fills a gas tank, or buys anything that arrives on a ship. Let's go back to March 11th, but not to the moment of impact. Go back further to the silence before it. For 4 days, there had been a strange, unsettling lull. Ships were cautiously resuming movement. Governments were watching. Analysts were cautiously optimistic. Some were even beginning to wonder if the pressure had worked, if Iran had read the room and decided to pull back. That silence was not retreat. It was preparation. On March 11th, 3 merchant vessels were struck in and around the Strait of Hormuz in rapid, coordinated succession. The first was a Thai-registered bulk carrier that had just departed a UAE port. It took the worst of it. 2 projectiles, officially described by authorities as being of unknown origin. That careful diplomatic phrasing is not ambiguity. It is code. It means Iranian drone strikes. The ship caught fire roughly 11 nautical miles north of Oman. 20 crew members were evacuated by the Omani Navy. 3 remained aboard in a desperate skeleton watch, waiting for rescue. That was the opening strike. It did not stop there. A Japanese container ship was hit next, struck by a projectile approximately 45 kilometers northwest of Ras Al Khaimah in the UAE. Damage was visible, but less catastrophic. No casualties. But the message was unmistakable. Then a third vessel, flying the flag of the Marshall Islands, was struck near the hull while anchored about 50 kilometers northwest of Dubai. Hull damage in the hold area. Again, no fatalities. But this was the third ship in a single unified operational sequence. 3 ships, 3 different flags, 3 different nationalities, 1 coordinated wave. By the most recent monitoring data available, at least 20 commercial vessels had been struck since hostilities escalated in late February. 20 ships. This is not harassment. This is not provocation theater. This is a sustained, deliberate, strategic campaign designed with a single purpose: to make the Strait of Hormuz economically uninhabitable for global commerce. An Iranian military spokesman made the strategy explicit, announcing to the world that not a single liter of oil would be permitted to pass through the strait for the benefit of the United States, Israel, or their partners. Any vessel whose cargo or ownership could be linked to those parties, he stated, would be considered a legitimate target. Read that carefully. That is not a military threat. That is a declaration of economic warfare against the global supply chain itself. To understand why that declaration carries such catastrophic weight, you have to understand the geography. The Strait of Hormuz is approximately 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, but tankers do not have 21 miles of freedom. The waterway is divided into designated shipping lanes, 1 inbound, 1 outbound, each roughly 2 miles wide, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. That reduces the functional navigable corridor to 6 miles. 6 miles that Iran's fast patrol boats can sweep and its drones can strike at will. Through those 6 effective miles flows approximately 20 million barrels of oil every single day. That represents somewhere between 20% and 30% of total global oil consumption. 88% of all oil leaving the Persian Gulf moves through this single choke point. There is no equivalent bypass. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline and the UAE's Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, even running at absolute maximum capacity, can together divert roughly 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. The Strait handles 20 million. The arithmetic is not complicated. It is brutal. You cannot pipeline your way out of this problem. This is Iran's real nuclear option, not a warhead, not an intercontinental missile, a choke point. The International Energy Agency described the disruption as the largest supply shock in recorded history. Oil prices surged more than 13%, briefly crossing $100 per barrel for the first time since early 2025. The Iranian spokesman's warning about $200 oil was not empty theater. The economic logic behind it is entirely real, and that is precisely why the American response came not in days, but in minutes. On March 10th, the sitting U.S. president issued a public warning. The language was direct and unambiguous. If Iran had placed mines in the Strait of Hormuz, they were to be removed immediately, or the military consequences would reach a scale never previously seen. That was the ultimatum. Iran did not comply. What happened next was not a delayed response assembled over hours of deliberation. 13 minutes after that public warning was issued, U.S. Central Command had already begun executing strikes. 10 Iranian mine-laying vessels were destroyed before the statement had even fully circulated. The trigger had been pulled before the warning finished echoing. By the end of the full operational sequence, 16 Iranian mine-laying ships had been eliminated. Beyond that, the last 4 vessels of an entire class of Iranian corvettes were destroyed. An entire category of Iranian warship erased from the order of battle permanently. And that was still not the complete picture. Since the beginning of the operation designated Epic Fury in late February, American forces had struck over 5,500 targets inside Iran. More than 60 of those were Iranian warships. The U.S. Secretary of Defense confirmed at a Pentagon briefing that Iranian missile launch capacity had been reduced by 90%, and one-way attack drone capability had been cut by 95%. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs added that Iran's entire ballistic missile production infrastructure, every facility, every supplier, every component manufacturer, had been functionally destroyed. This is what the application of overwhelming military force with deliberate intent actually looks like. But here's the part that almost every analysis skips past, and it is the most important part of this entire story. You can destroy 16 mine layers, you can sink corvettes, you can level production facilities and crater naval bases, and the Strait of Hormuz will still not be open. As of mid-March, the historical average of 138 daily transits through the strait had collapsed to a count of 2 cargo vessels and 1 tanker moving openly, 2 and 1, from 138. On a single day tracked by maritime analysts, only 10 transits were recorded, and half of those were Iranian vessels, ghost fleet tankers running dark with their identification systems deliberately disabled, invisible to international tracking, moving through a corridor that the rest of the world's shipping industry had quietly abandoned. That is not an open strait. That is a ghost corridor, and the violence did not pause to allow the wreckage to cool. The day after the mine layer destruction, 2 more vessels were struck off the coast of Iraq in the early hours of the morning. Both caught fire. 38 crew members were rescued from the water. 1 person did not survive. The attacks were continuing, not despite the overwhelming military response, but almost indifferent to it. And that indifference is the key to understanding what Iran is actually trying to achieve. Iran is not trying to win a military engagement. It knows with complete clarity that it cannot. What it is doing is something far more calculated and in many ways far more dangerous. It is engineering a state of permanent, unquantifiable risk, not risk that governments absorb, not risk that navies manage, risk that lands on the desk of a commercial shipping owner and his insurance broker at 3 in the morning and forces them to conclude that the mathematics simply do not work anymore. Because when the math breaks, the ships stop moving. And the ships have already stopped moving. War risk insurance for vessels transiting the strait was pulled entirely in early March. When war risk insurance disappears from a region, it does not mean the danger has become severe. It means the danger has become effectively incalculable. Insurers cannot price what they cannot model. Ship owners cannot operate without coverage, so they do not go. Iran understands insurance markets. That is not a coincidence or a side effect. It is part of the weapon. The financial architecture of global shipping is itself a target, and Iran has been hitting it with precision. So where does the international response stand? France announced what its president described as an unprecedented naval deployment: 2 helicopter carriers, 8 frigates, and a full aircraft carrier group directed toward the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean. The stated purpose is to work alongside American and allied vessels to begin physically escorting commercial ships through the corridor. Analysis from naval monitoring organizations suggests that in the short term, using 7 or 8 destroyers providing air cover, it may be possible to escort 3 to 4 commercial vessels per day, though not through the Strait proper, and only if the Iranian submarine threat remains manageable. Sustaining that effort across months requires resources on a scale that has not yet been formally committed. Britain has also entered the picture. The UK Secretary of State for Defense confirmed that autonomous mine hunting systems have been prepositioned in the region, and that active discussions are underway with allied planners about what additional capabilities could be deployed. The characterization from London was unambiguous. What Iran is doing constitutes a breach of international law with direct, measurable consequences for oil prices and the cost of living for ordinary people everywhere. This is no longer a bilateral confrontation between Washington and Tehran. It is becoming a coalition operation, and that shift fundamentally changes the strategic calculus. Iran's strategy of maritime economic strangulation only functions effectively if it is pressuring a single adversary in isolation. The moment escort convoys form, the moment allied warships are sailing alongside commercial vessels through contested water, the question Iran must answer changes entirely. It is no longer whether Iranian drones can hit tankers. It becomes whether Iranian drones can hit tankers while simultaneously absorbing retaliation from allied air power, naval surface groups, and electronic warfare systems operating in coordination. The answer to that question is no. But complications remain, and serious analysts are watching them with considerable unease. Iran still possesses hundreds of fast attack craft, small, agile, capable of carrying drones, rockets, or explosive payloads. Some of them require no crew at all. Remote-controlled surface vessels packed with explosives, conceptually identical to the maritime drones Ukraine deployed against Russia's Black Sea Fleet, represent a category of threat that air cover alone does not neutralize cleanly. And despite all the destruction already inflicted, Iran's fast attack boat fleet has been notably absent from the primary engagement zones. That absence is not reassurance. It is a variable. It may mean Iran is deliberately preserving that capability for a later, more decisive phase of this fight. And then there is the dimension that transforms a serious crisis into a potentially civilization-scale economic emergency. Iran's proxies in Yemen have been watching every development in the Strait with close attention. Their leadership has been explicit. Their fingers, they say, are on the trigger. If the Houthis re-enter the Red Sea in force, which their current arsenal is fully capable of supporting, then the global shipping catastrophe does not merely continue. It doubles. 2 choke points simultaneously contested, the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb both partially or fully closed at the same time. Saudi pipeline alternatives that route through the Red Sea corridor become themselves vulnerable to Houthi strikes. The emergency bypasses close. Every remaining alternative narrows to nothing. Global energy markets would face a disruption without any historical comparison whatsoever. That is the nightmare architecture, and it is not hypothetical. It is one decision away. Wherever you are watching or reading this, you are already paying for what is happening in those 6 miles of contested water. Every time fuel prices rise at the pump, every electricity bill that climbs, every imported product that costs more than it did 6 months ago, that is the financial transmission of this conflict arriving in your daily life. The International Energy Agency's release of 400 million barrels from strategic reserves is a pressure valve, not a solution. It is a temporary patch applied to what is becoming a structural rupture. And structural ruptures in global energy do not resolve themselves across weeks. They reprice across years. Iran's new supreme leadership has already broken its public silence on the matter, stating openly that the Strait of Hormuz should remain closed. That is not a negotiating position floated through back channels. That is a declared strategic objective announced to the world. If that objective holds even partially, even imperfectly, the energy price shock currently being absorbed as an acute crisis begins transitioning into a permanent new baseline. Markets, supply chains, and national economies will be forced to adapt to a world in which the assumptions that governed global energy trade for the past half century no longer reliably hold. Two paths remain visible from this vantage point, and neither is stable. The first runs through coalition pressure achieving its intended effect, Allied naval presence making the political and military cost of continued Iranian strikes against escorted commercial shipping too high to sustain. Iran's leadership, operating from a position of severe and accelerating military degradation, concludes that the leverage gamble has failed. Quiet diplomatic channels open. A ceasefire framework takes shape in the background. Oil prices ease. The world exhales shallowly with considerable unresolved anxiety about what was just discovered about its own vulnerabilities. The second path runs through escalation. Iran, calculating that its remaining fast attack capability represents a closing window, deploys it before losing it. A convoy is struck. An Allied vessel takes casualties. The response is overwhelming and irreversible. The Ghost Fleet, still loading crude at Iranian island terminals, becomes a new target set. China, Iran's dominant oil customer, faces a geopolitical choice it has spent years engineering its foreign policy specifically to avoid. The Houthis move. Both choke points close. No one wins. Every economy on Earth bleeds at a rate that makes the current disruption look like a prelude. Here is what this entire episode ultimately forces into the open. Iran played the one card it spent 4 decades carefully preserving, the card whose existence alone was supposed to be sufficient deterrence. And within 13 minutes of the first warning, 10 of its mine-laying ships were already burning. Within 72 hours, an entire class of its warships had ceased to exist. Its missile capacity gutted by 90%, its drone production infrastructure functionally destroyed, its navy broken, and yet, as of mid-March, only 3 ships were transiting the Strait of Hormuz openly. Iran is losing the military confrontation comprehensively. It is still partially winning the economic one. That asymmetry, military defeat coexisting with economic disruption, is the actual story of what is happening. The most uncomfortable question this crisis forces onto the table is not about Iran's capabilities or American firepower or French carrier groups. It is this: the world has known for 40 years that a single nation sitting beside a 21-mile waterway held a potential veto over 20% of global oil supply. 40 years. And in that time, the world built essentially no serious structural alternative to that single choke point. What that says about how global power, economic planning, and strategic foresight actually function, that question will outlast every ship that burned in the Strait, and it deserves an honest answer.